Snow fell, the way ash settles after a burn, slow and persuasive, filling the lot until the painted lines disappeared and the gate learned humility. I parked nose out so the plow could find me if it ever made the climb, and let the engine tick itself quiet. Cold crept in through the seams, and the cab gathered a skin of frost along the glass. The trailhead kiosk crouched under a drift like a small animal, keeping its secrets. My job was to hold the line at the gate, keep the trail closed until the switchback settled, and the cornices gave up their bad ideas. Simple on paper. In real weather, nothing stays simple. I shrugged into the Ranger parka, heavy with melted and refrozen edges, slid the snow shovel from its brackets, and stepped down into night that was more gray than black. The wind had an argument with itself among the firs, rushing down canyon, then circling back and lifting powder into a glitter I only saw when I moved. The air smelled right, wet cedar, fresh cut from a branch the storm had pruned. But underneath lived an old machine breath, faint and oily, like the memory of a snowmobile that had passed and never stopped passing. Routine first. I cleared the pad around the gate to keep the drift from welding steel to steel. Scoop, heave, step backward, repeat until the bar swung free. I brushed the lock with a mitten, tapped a crust loose, checked that the chain still walked the rings. The state truck's tow strap slept coiled behind the seat, in case someone decided the rules were for other people. I placed 2 roadside flares where the plow would expect them, angled low into the berm so their light stayed useful, not boastful, then tucked the spent caps into a pocket to avoid leaving bright litter for spring. The trail counter, a small box that watched the boundary between lot and path, blinked a steady green. I wiped its eye with a cloth and read the tiny clicker inside my head the way I had done every storm season. Nothing yet, just wind and snow pretending to be feet. I left the box to its work and walked the plow's loop to read the lot itself, because the lot always talks if you let it. The first anomaly came softly, not in the snow itself, but in the way the sound lay over it. On the upwind side of the kiosk, I heard the plow blade that wasn't present, a long metallic hush from down below, then silence too clean to follow. Sometimes the highway crews paused at the avalanche gate to eat or scrape ice from wipers, and sound carried strange up the canyon. That was ordinary. This had a delay built into it, as if the blade had been dragged through a room I could not stand in. I filed it where such things go, not immediate, not actionable, but worth remembering when the night takes a turn. I kept to the checklist because a list keeps fear from inventing work. Lot perimeter, good. Gate signage, good. Trail closure, board, straight, legible, weighed with a sling of cord so the wind wouldn't make it lie. I knocked ice from the kiosk's plastic panels and found the season map beneath, the familiar switchback stitching up a slope that the storm was trying to unthread. The snow along the kiosk base told a small story of visitors from earlier in the day, ordinary prints softening into bowls. A dog had gone out and back, a circle near the trash can where it had expressed an opinion, a pair of boots that shuffled like someone learning their shoes. Nothing wrong in any of it. Then, past the boards and into the first shadows of the trail, a set of impressions that were sharp where the wind should have rounded them, and rounded where the wind should have cut. I squinted against flakes and steadied the headlamp with a palm to keep the beam honest. The prints faced downhill, heels crisp, toes feathered by blown crystals. I let that sit. The wind had been running down canyon for as long as the drive. Any fresh deposit should have filled toes first. What I saw looked well kept, as if they had been sheltered by something that moved with them. I did not follow. Orders were clear. Do not enter the trail alone at night during an active storm unless human life is confirmed at risk. The risk was probable in this country, and the country did not care for our scales. I keyed the radio and gave a calm report. Lot intact, gate snow-lipped but functional, closure in effect, no vehicles present, wind from the higher basin sliding into the trees. I added the print description and asked for confirmation on plow timing. Dispatch answered on the first beat, voice steady and warm the way the good ones are when they know you're cold. Highway crews were delayed by slides, staging at the lower sheds, maybe more than an hour if the storm kept throwing. An hour in this weather was a long story. I thanked them and left the carrier open for an extra breath, listening for bleed that would tell me someone else was trying to come through. Nothing but the polite hiss of air. I worked the shovel again because I needed the heat. The lot drifted along the wind lines on its own schedule, filling one side while the other stayed strangely vacant, as if the weather had been willing a path for a truck that never arrived. When the blade caught a crust at the edge nearest the trees, I felt a tone through the wood, low and steady, not from the steel, but from the snowfield itself. Some slopes sing. They telegraph their mood through the obvious cracks and the hush beneath your boots. Here, the ground hummed like a heavy wire, a tautness that did not belong to a plowed parking lot. I stopped moving to sort sound from breath. The tone faded as soon as I stilled, then returned when I took 2 careful steps. It stayed with me for a few yards and then let go. I marked to the line with a glove edge and kept clearing until my shoulders burned enough to make thinking easy. By the time I checked the trail counter again, the night had grown a degree meaner. Flakes came slant, not dance, and every gust had a core the parka could not ignore. The counter blinked as before. I listened to the click inside the casing, the tiny certainty of it, and felt a mild comfort in machines that simply do what they do. I turned to the impressions under the furs to see if wind had made them honest yet. They felt closer to the kiosk than before, though I had not moved them, and the drift should have softened their edges. I measured with my boot from the locked chain to the nearest heel, and decided tiredness was cheating the eye. I told myself the snow that packs at the base of the signposts can shift the way a shoreline shifts. It can make the world seem different without truly moving anything. That worked until I crouched and brushed loose crystals from one toe. Beneath the crust a wetness showed, not meltwater from my heat, but a polished plane like ice formed, then lifted and set down. The smell rose then, wrong for the hour, something like heated belt rubber and the faintest thread of pond algae, out of place under fir and hemlock. I stood because standing felt like a decision. I keyed the radio again and logged it with careful words, so later I'd have a record that didn't sound like a story. Possible mechanical odor near trail start, variable direction with gusts, unknown source, unusual firmness in snowpack adjacent to kiosk, tones underfoot during shoveling, likely refrozen plow berm interacts with buried ice. Dispatch repeated it back with the tidy cadence that keeps doubt from taking root. They asked if I wanted a second ranger. I looked at the lot with its 2 flares whispering orange into gray, and thought about the switchbacks up beyond the first rise. The cliff bands that like to shed cornice slabs when the wind shifts, the blind curves on the road the plow would need to fight. I asked for a check-in schedule instead. I would call at regular intervals and not enter the trail without confirmation. Good copy, they said, and left the air clear. The wind tested the chain. It lifted it just enough to make the lock tap the bar like patient fingers. I closed the pad's mouth over the clappers so the song wouldn't carry down canyon and invite what I didn't want. Then I walked the line where lot meets trail again, slower this time, light off for a stretch so I could feel the place instead of forcing it to show me pictures. Snow speaks louder when you stop pointing lights at it. In that dark, with the flakes on my hood knitting a faint drumbeat, a shape of quiet formed beyond the kiosk. Not empty, that would have been easy, but a pocket where sound went to ground and came back late, as if the air there had a thickness to it. I held my breath and waited out the small thunder in my ears. When I exhaled, the pocket answered by narrowing toward the prints. The odor came back, faded again, returned not from the trail but from the lot, then from the road, then again from the trail, as if carried by a loop I couldn't map. I did the only thing that made sense inside the bounds I was given. I set 2 fresh flares near the chain, not to scare anything but to mark the boundary in a language even wind reads. I laid the shovel across the lower rail of the gate where I could find it without looking. I pulled the tow strap out and draped it over the bumper, where cold couldn't harden its coils too much. Because when rule breaks come, they never wait for fingers to negotiate stiff nylon. Then I stood next to the trail counter and watched its patient light and listened for the internal click that means a pass. The wind carried a hush that might have been plow blade, might have been creek under snow, might have been the lot singing again. The prints sat where they sat, toes made neat by weather that should have ruined them. I told the radio I would hold position at the kiosk and observe. I told myself that waiting is a skill, and tonight it would have to be enough. The counter kept its rhythm. The chain tapped its small, disciplined song. The pocket of quiet did not leave. Somewhere down the canyon, a light showed beneath snow for a breath, and then folded into the storm as if it had never been. I took that as a hint that the night had chosen its pace, and I matched it, one careful breath at a time. Wind built ribs across the lot and smoothed them just as fast, a steady carpentry I tried not to take personally. I stood under the kiosk roof where the drift made a short wall and let the hood catch the flakes before they reached my face. The trail counter kept its green eye and its private metronome. I listened until my breathing matched it. That is a trick rangers learn so the hours don't come apart. The chain at the gate tapped the bar in its patient way, and the flares made low domes of color that the storm walked over without respect. I kept my hands busy, glove seam checked, parka zipper walked up and down to keep ice from welding it. Shovel edge scraped free so it would take a bite when I needed it again. I went back to the impressions beneath the furs to see if the wind had argued them into normal. The storm had worked every other edge in the lot. Here, the curves stayed clean as if a cup had been pressed and lifted, the surface polished under its rim. I took the shovel and cut a small square beside the nearest heel mark, jiggling the blade to hear the snow speak. The tone came up from below, a wire hum that belonged to Cornish country and not to a parking apron. I pried the square and held it in my mitten. The underside gleamed like ice that had met heat and then been told to behave. The smell rose again, the wrong note in a familiar song, belt rubber after friction, and the algae-thin breath of Old Lake, a scent you usually meet in thaw season near a culvert, not on a ridge at night. Procedure says report before you begin to believe. I keyed the radio, gave lot conditions, wind behavior, and the observation at the kiosk base. I logged the odor and the odd firmness as likely effects of refrozen plow berm and buried creek lens, though I didn't like the way the words felt in my mouth. Dispatch read it back with their careful even tone and added an update I did not enjoy hearing. Crews still held at the sheds, a slide matrix upriver, and request stacking behind mine. I copied, clear and simple. The only thing worse than a long night is a long night with melodrama on the air. I set a fresh pair of flares along the inner arc of the lot to make a shallow lane from the truck to the gate, bent them into the berm so the light was awash, not a beacon. I hung the tow strap off the bumper where my hands could find it without thinking, and shook the loops so they would not freeze into opinionated shapes. When a storm has you waiting, set the stage. You will work better when the problem finally shows its face. I brushed the counter's lens again and steadied its housing. The green eye kept pace, and I didn't need to open it to hear the click, because the casing carried the little thrum into my glove. The prints had been downhill, neat and stubborn. Now they seemed to stand nearer the chain than they had a quarter hour before, aligned as before, heels square, toes feathered. I measured with body memory, steps from the kiosk to the rail, steps from the rail to the first mark. Then I stopped counting in my head, because the voice in my training that doesn't tolerate games said to pay attention to other things. The wind shifted for a breath, not a new direction so much as a bend inside the old one, and the pocket of quiet I had felt earlier turned narrow, like a path between racks in a storeroom. In that pocket the snow quit talking, and the flares seemed lower, as if the air had weight there. When the wind resumed its usual song, the pocket stayed. I didn't walk into it. A ranger alone at a closed trail in a storm does not chase mysteries off the plowed margin, not without a reason that fits in a logbook. Instead, I did something small. I took a mitten full of loose crystals and let them sift over the foremost print, a thin veil I knew the next gust would sort. The gust came, obedient as a classroom bell. It pawed at the veil and whisked the rest of the lot into new shapes. And when it passed, the print looked the same as before while the snow I had dropped around it was gone. Shadowing says shelter. Shelter implies mass. I did not like where that logic wanted to lead, so I wrote it down inside my head and did not say it aloud. The sound motif returned, the plow blade that wasn't here sweeping some far, tiled floor. It arrived not from the road, but from the darkness uphill, then bled into the hiss of my hood and the light patter of flakes on the kiosk roof. I shut my eyes for a breath to catch timing, and heard a late echo. Not a true echo, but an answer that preferred to think first. When I opened them, the counter's green blink lined up with that delay, as if they shared a clock they hadn't told me about. I put a mitten to the casing side and felt the small, confident heart of it. I needed that. I thought about the people who test locks in weather like this, the drivers who believed the rules were written for someone weaker than their vehicle. The tire pattern in the lot had been nothing but my own. Still, I pulled the strap down and walked it to the gate, set it over the bar where a quick hitch could be made if I had to nose the truck into a drift to block entry. The chain did not love the gesture and tapped once with a sharper tone, like a muttered warning. I put the strap back on the bumper because clarity matters. My posture at the gate is policy, and policy keeps you alive when nerves would choose flash over sense. When the radio crackled this time, it carried less warmth and more empty room, as if the voice had to travel through a hallway before it reached me. A simple welfare check from dispatch, and I answered quick to keep the shape of the call clean. Between our lines, I heard something like water under a lid. Not creak, not culvert. A low round pressure that made my teeth feel watched. They signed off, and I let the carrier hum for a breath too long, listening for a third person who didn't exist. The storm obliged with nothing but weather. I tried the oldest kind of test, the kind you don't put in manuals because it looks too simple. I stood with my back to the lot and looked up into the trees without moving my feet. Sometimes a slope will show its troubles when you stop insisting the ground be the only stage. The fir tops leaned and released. Their snow shook off in long veils that landed with soft smacks near the kiosk. Between two trunks, a darker piece of dark shifted, then steadied as my eyes learned the trick of it. That would be a stump, I told myself, or a burnt snag, or a boulder wearing a hood. When I lowered my gaze, the prints at the trail mouth had changed in a way I could not talk away. The nearest pair no longer faced downhill. Their toes now leaned toward the lot. A slant of attention pointed at the chain. I wanted to enter the trail right then, to follow the line and set flags at each turn, to make the situation a terrain problem instead of something that lives in the space between certainty and story. Orders are not there to make you feel caged. They are there to keep you from trading your life for a tidy narrative. I lifted the radio and said to the voice I trusted that footprints had altered orientation in a way not easily explained by wind, that no human figures were visible, that I would maintain position and request second unit when crews allowed. The voice responded with measured approval, which is how experienced dispatchers tell you they don't like what you've said, but they like that you said it cleanly. Temperature lives in pockets. I walked the lot edge 1 palm's distance from the chain and felt the night move from knife to dull between one step and the next. A breath of warmer air, you learn to call anything warmer when your lashes are rimmed, slid over my face and ran down the inside of the parka, like water would if water could be air. In the same moment, the nearest flare guttered not with wind, but with a slow bow, flame lowering to the snow as if pressed by a hand. I raised my palm into the pocket and met nothing but ordinary cold. I lowered it and found the bowing again as if the air had an underside. The counter clicked then, a bright little tick that leaped through the housing and into my glove. Its green eye kept time. The chain stayed still. The snow in front of the lens was unbroken. I waited for the second click that would tell me the device had misread the wind, but the little box declined to give me that comfort. I wiped the lens and crouched to look beneath the beam's height. The world at that level smelled like metal and cedar, and a thin stripe of swamp that did not have any business in this drainage. When I stood, my boot prints at the kiosk were clean bowls, and the other prints were closer by the kind of degree your mind calls a trick if your mind wants sleep. The toes held their new angle, fixed on the chain as if reading the lock for a weak weld. A soft light rose down canyon. Truck, I thought, and I turned to flag it in case a driver needed a warm cab and a talk about weather. The light went low behind the curve and stayed there, as if the road had dipped into a pocket of its own. I kept my arm up longer than a person with pride should. When I brought it down, the lot was my lot again. The flares made their small promises, and the storm worked the same seam in the same way. I breathed the mask of it in and out until the edge came off my pulse. I walked back to the kiosk with the shovel under my arm the way a carpenter carries his tool when he knows the next cut will matter. I set the blade so it touched the lower rail of the gate. A simple alarm my hands would feel if the chain lifted. I rested my palm on the counter casing and let its little heart remind mine to behave. I told the radio I was holding that I had established markers, that I would not approach the trail without support. While I spoke, the pocket of quiet crept from the firs toward the chain, slow as frost forming, and the nearest print, the one I had dusted with loose snow, gained a shallow shine like ice under breath. I finished the transmission and waited for the click that says, "You are alone again." The wind passed. The chain did not move. The counter kept count of a thing I could not see. The toes did not blink. I set my boots at a bracing angle and decided that sometimes survival means choosing to be the still point and making the storm move around you. Wind loaded the kiosk roof until it moaned against its brackets, a thin, steady note that made conversation in my head switch to whispers. I kept my post between the chain and the counter because those were the two honest instruments I owned that night. The parka's hood stitched its soft drum beat. The shovel leaned where I had placed it so the blade kissed the lower rail. Any lift at the chain would speak through steel to wood to bone. The flares sat inside their shallow cradles and spent their light without complaint. The prints by the firs held their angle toward the lot, and if they had crept again, they had done so by a distance too narrow to name without lying to myself. Procedure kept my feet still even as the mind pushed for a path. I gave dispatch another calm check, held the carrier an extra breath to listen for the hallway in the line, then clipped the mic back where my glove could find it blind. The lamp in my truck cab had a habit of waking when the weather jarred the switch just right. It was not a thing I trusted, only a glow that let me read a map without headlamp spill. Through the frost I saw it wink and then hold, a low amber that bounced off the windshield like breath. I told myself the door wiring had shifted as the cab cooled and warmed and cooled again in storm rhythm. Then the light hiccuped, as if someone outside had cupped a hand over it and removed the hand in the same motion, and the hairs along the back of my neck decided to learn a new lesson. I walked slow to the truck, boots careful on the polished crust where the lot had shown its wire hum earlier, and opened the door enough to shut the lamp off with 2 fingers. The dome obeyed. The wrong odor rode up from the floor mat when I leaned in. That thin belt smell with the lake thread under it. The scent of thaw water coaxed from cold clay. And for a breath I could hear drops that did not fall tapping metal that was not there. I stepped back into weather where honest sounds live. Back at the gate, the chain watched me the way inanimate things will when you give them too much authority. The counter's green eye blinked once and then steadied. The click came a beat later, firm as ever, a count of 1 in a world that had shown me nothing crossing the beam. I lifted the housing, checked the mount, wiped the lens with a cloth I kept dry inside the parka's inner pocket. The casing buzzed faintly, not wrong, just a touch louder than it had been, like a clock you only notice when the house empties. I made a note aloud, the way people do when they plan to remember, equipment nominal, perception unreliable, wait and verify. Under the kiosk roof, the small service cubby held a battered battery lantern meant for winter notices and lost and found. I set it on the bench and worked the switch through its stubborn moods until the lens produced a flat circle of light, no brighter than a pocket of day. It belonged to me because I had put fresh cells in it at season start, and its compromises were familiar. I aimed it at the closure board to clean off another rind of ice. The beam wavered. I tapped the body. The beam steadied, then glazed a touch green and leaned toward the furs like a compass does toward a nail. I set it down and watched. Wind did not make it wander. My hand over the lens did not make it wander. The lantern chose its own tilt toward the trail mouth and held it as if that were the natural way for light to behave. When I lifted it, the beam swung through me and settled again on the prints with the lazy insistence of a person pointing at the same word every time you open the book. I told the radio I was activating auxiliary lighting and would maintain visual on the closure. I did not say that the lamp had developed preferences. I set the lantern inside the kiosk, so it threw a long blade along the chain and into the quiet pocket I had learned to feel more than see. The flares brightened their surfaces in response, then dipped faintly as if the air had lengthened between flame and snow. I took the shovel and walked a slow arc just this side of the trail line, testing the crust with gentle chops, listening for the wire note. It came at the same places and then no longer at the same places, a drift in sound that did not track with wind or load. When I made a shallow cut, the undersurface flashed wet for a blink and went dull again, like ice learning a trick and then refusing to perform it twice. The tree line whispered numbers from the old storm catalog in my head. Angles, exposures, cornice habits, none of which I would speak aloud in this voice, not because numbers are monsters, but because tonight they would be the wrong language. I concentrated instead on what the land offered without math. The slope carried its weight well. The crowns cracked once, far up the gully, then held. The snow at knee level lifted in scumbled layers when the gusts punched, the kind that build slabs on lee faces. The lot felt like a porch where a house breathes beside you. What did not feel domestic were the temperature seams. Step left and the world held its dull, honest cold. Step right, 1 boot length, and an exhale slid warm down the inside of my sleeve, and settled like a shawl along the wrist and over the pulse. I stood inside that seam until my skin decided it was not comfort, and my training decided to honor that verdict. The prints themselves had their own climate. I knelt at the nearest toe and watched loose crystals skate over the shine, pause, then roll around as if meeting a dome of air on the snow's surface. When my breath went forward, it pooled and drifted sideways instead of pushing straight. The wrong smell rose and thinned, carried not by the gusts, but by a slower mechanism I couldn't name. I reached with the shovel and shaved a sliver from the snow beside the mark, let it rest on the blade to listen. The hum came up from the lot again, and then translated into something rounder under the shovel. Not a wire, but a skin being plucked. I set the sliver down where it would not mix with the prints and stepped back because I was beginning to treat the snow like a laboratory, and the snow hates that. A truck's light lifted once more down canyon. I raised a hand without hope. The light rose, dimmed, rose again through shreds of storm, and then sat low behind the curve as if the road's shape had been redrawn. I thought about the tow strap resting in its coil, and how many times I had pulled spin-happy drivers out of the easy ditch at the lot mouth. The same narrow humiliation repeated every first snowfall of a season. The strap felt heavy with those other nights when I lifted it, the nylon stiff but workable, the hooks cold enough to nip through the glove. I didn't hitch it. I needed it ready, not on display. I set it over the bumper and shook it down so each loop lay clean. The lantern's beam twitched and went thin, then pulsed like a heartbeat that was not mine. The bulb had never done that in my hands. I turned off my headlamp and let the lot be a field of low domes and a blade of greenish light and whatever the storm would spare. In the quieter darkness, the chain sounded closer, though I had not moved, a small metal breath against the bar. The counter ticked once, not in step with its old metronome, but in a thoughtful way, as if listening before committing to the count. I put my palm against its side and felt it vibrate, the soft way a creature settles when it wants company. If the thing near the trail had a shape, I did not detect it with the eyes. What I had were timings. The plow blade that did not exist sighed from uphill. Then the pocket of quiet narrowed. Then the lantern's beam leaned. Then the counter considered and chose to click. The order held for a cycle, broke for another, held again. I said the chain was the only actor I cared to measure, and took the shovel off the rail to keep the steel from talking for me. When I moved the blade, the nearest flare bent its flame downward slowly, as if accepting the heavier air. The draw stopped when the shovel settled back. I did it again and watched the same ritual play out. A small bow, a small release. I told the radio I was observing variable air pressure localized to entrance markers, cause unknown, and requested second unit on non-emergent basis when road status allowed. The answer came warm again, less hallway, more human, and I felt a stray relief I had not invited. I needed heat and thought about the shelter of the truck. The lamp switched off by my own hand. I did not want the cab to become a theater for light that had learned new tricks, so I stripped the parka's zipper down one notch and let the cold do what it does best: keep you awake, keep you honest. The hood's fur stiffened with frost and crackled near my ears when I turned. The sound had a bungalow comfort compared to the night's other voices. I stood with boots braced and made a promise that cost nothing and would cost everything if broken. I would not step over the chain for any reason that did not fit in a line and a half of writing. Time and weather is a poor historian. I marked it by the flares, which had become short red flowers crouching in their own light, and by the way the wind dragged a seam across the lot and stitched it again. The prince refused to leave. That should have brought anger. It brought a steadier calm than I expected, the kind that comes when your job is a small, clear thing inside a large, unclear one. The lantern fluttered and steadied, a pulse I could have matched if I wanted to share a heart with it. I kept my own pace. The counter ticked once more without an image to bless. The chain held its temper. The pocket of quiet drew nearer until the gap between it and the gate was only as wide as a thought. I stood on my side of the thought and held. The storm worked. The trees nodded at the rules they have always kept. The night added its pieces to my small ledger and refused to sign its name. The call-out that should have come as a simple confirmation dragged its feet and then forgot my name. I keyed the mic and gave the tidy phrases that fit in a log. Lot stable, closure intact, auxiliary lighting established, unusual pressure changes at the entrance. But the carrier answered with a room instead of a voice, a hallway of air where the words went to soften. I waited and let the wind fill in for them. When dispatch finally replied, the line had a stutter, a small kneel in the middle of the sentence, as if the sound had to step around something set on the floor between us. I repeated my last line slower, careful not to add color. Their answer came back lighter, the warmth returning as if a person had taken the mic from the hallway and brought it near a table lamp. Copy on all, they said. Hold position. Second unit remains staged. I copied, then kept the carrier open just long enough to listen for the faraway water lid tone that had visited earlier. The night gave me only its own hush and the soft grit of snow against plastic. The lantern's beam leaned and straightened in a rhythm that felt less like a failing bulb and more like a breath that had learned patience. I set it lower on the bench so the blade of light ran beneath the chain, and licked the first impression under the furs. The toe shone, dulled, shone again. When I stood in the lantern's path, the light ran up my parka and found every seam I had ever resewn, then slid around me and resumed the same angle as if I were a temporary rock in a long stream. I did not step over. I took half a step back until my boot heel met the plowed ridge and let the shovel handle rest against my knee so the blade still touched the gate rail. A simple alarm, simple as good. The pocket of quiet I had grown used to feeling rather than seeing no longer kept to the trees. It crept until the skin of it brushed my sleeves and the flare nearest the chain bowed again, flame hugging the snow as if pressed by a slow palm. I covered the lantern lens with my glove and thought about killing its light entirely, but the lot had accepted it as a participant, and things with voice do not like to be silenced mid-word. I eased my hand away. The beam returned soft. The faint green cast back like a bruise you forget until you see it under a certain bathroom bulb. Procedure says, widen the safe zone when the edge starts moving. I dragged a trench along the inside of the chain with the shovel, not deep, just enough to give my body a line it would respect, even if curiosity tried to bargain. The shovel sang a tired little chord when it hit the crust that carries sound like wire. The note rose and steadied under the blade, and then translated into skin again. A drumhead hummed by a patient thumb. I stopped, because listening felt like participating. The counter clicked, a small honest tick that rode through the casing into my palm, and told me the device believed something had crossed the beam. The snow beneath the lens was blank. I tapped the housing as if it were a barometer stuck between moods. The green eye blinked and resumed its metronome. I looked not at the ground, but at the air where the beam would live if the world were smoke. A fine snow traced it for a breath, and in that brief line the light bent as though the air had a kink. The effect vanished when the gust shifted. I wiped the lens again and told the radio about the false count. The reply came too quick, a sure sign that the person on the other end did not like the shape of things and wanted to keep the tempo up. Copy, log as equipment anomaly, maintain position. I said copy, back with the same briskness, because people on radios recognize strain in tones, and kindness sometimes means giving them the rhythm they can stand. Something in the forest decided to test its snow load. A soft billow fell from a fir, then another, then a creak that did not end in a crack, but in a drawn-out hold, the wood considering its options. The wrong smell followed the hush, a faint belt heat braided with a wet clay memory. Not strong, never strong, just there enough to teach the mind to pay attention. The odor seemed to choose its moments, a rise when the lantern leaned, a thinning when the flares brightened, a return when the chain tapped its faint metallic patience against the bar. I tried to break the pattern by moving through it. I walked to the truck and back at a pace that kept my breath within the mask, checked the bed for tools I did not need, confirmed the toe strap lay free and obedient over the bumper. The pattern merely shifted around my steps, like fog, that is more interested in its own path than in yours. I spoke aloud the checklist for a night like this so I would not lose the easy wins. Gate locked and seated, signage firm, kiosk clear, vehicle ready, strap ready, shovel edge clean, lantern powered, counter observed. Then I added the stranger items because writing them in the air could make them less theatrical. Pocket of quiet moving toward gate, pressure that bows flame, light that leans, prints that resist wind and turn of their own accord, odor out of season, sound like a blade not present, from uphill not road. I let the list end there because a list becomes a ladder if you keep climbing, and I did not want to look down. When I keyed the mic again, the call did not go. The transmit light on the head smiled the way it always does, indifferent and bright, but the carrier returned nothing, as if the hallway from before had been filled with packing blankets. I released, waited, and tried again. The same blank. I lifted the set from its cradle and reseated it, a cabin habit as old as handsets. Still nothing. I took the spare portable from the parka and keyed. The spare made a brave little click, and then coughed a puff of static that sounded like snow against a tent wall. I did not have a failure tone, only absence, which is worse because it begs interpretations. I held both mics a breath apart, and listened as if the space between them might host an answer. It hosted only weather. There are moments when work shrinks to the size of a seed, and all you can do is hold it in your palm and keep it warm. I stood between chain and counter, and became that small. The lantern pulsed. The flares lowered and rose with their slow courtesy. The wind drew its seam across the lot and stitched it again. The prints at the trail mouth gained a sugared rim where stray crystals gathered and refused to cling. Beads rolling the way, water beads on oiled metal. I let that image sit without choosing a meaning. The cold pressed in with a practical hand, and I thanked it because it kept my thoughts from drifting into stories. Without the radio, time tried to melt, so I fixed it with work. I scraped the plow berm at the lot mouth where the drift had begun to build its own quiet gate. I shoveled the trench I had made so the line stayed visible if the flares died. I tightened the chain slack a half link, not enough to change the official closure, just enough to silence the tap that had started to sound like a clock. That silence felt better until I realized I had removed a warning bell. I loosened the chain again and gave back the tap, because honest sounds are friends even when they wear on you. The forest offered up a long patience then, a stretch where nothing altered enough to write down, and yet everything stayed attentive. The pocket of quiet held its position at the chain like a polite visitor, waiting for a receptionist to look up. I swallowed, and my throat sounded too loud. The lantern's beam thinned to a fine thread, and then swelled again, like tide under glass. The counter did not click, and the way it refrained became its own kind of message. I tried the portable a second time. This time a scrap of voice came through, the syllables torn by distance and by that same packing blanket damp. I caught my call sign in a single word that could have been copy, could have been coffee, could have been any comfort you reach for when lines go soft. I answered with a clarity made possible only by practice and fear, said my name, the trailhead name, my status, the equipment state, the request for second unit when safe, the decision to hold. The reply fell out of the hallway and onto the floor, a burst of static that ended not in a clean cut, but in the lightest of clicks, the kind a person makes when they take their thumb off a mic and wait to see if you will speak again. I did not. I set the portable where I could grab it without looking, and returned my attention to the only instruments that had not learned tricks: chain, shovel, flares, strap, body memory. When the prints changed next, the change was small, which made it worse. Not closer, not farther. The angle of the toes lost their tidy aim and turned a fraction, neither toward the lot nor fully away, a posture people adopt when they reconsider a door. I felt the pull in my calf the way you feel the lead on a dog before the shoulder moves. I braced and let the emotion pass like a gust. I said aloud, again, that I would not step over the chain without a reason that fits in a line and a half. The vow steadied me in a way coffee never has. The storm pressed one more low ceiling onto the lot, and then eased, the flakes thick and slow as if deciding things. The wrong smell returned and thinned and returned again, never strong, never claiming ownership, more like a traveler insisting a place along the wall. I watched the lantern pulse. I watched the flares bow and recover. I held a palm to the counter's housing and felt its small, constant life. I made the lot as small as I could and stood in it the way a person stands in a doorway during a power outage, listening to a house breathe. When the radio chose to be a house again, I would talk. Until then, the tools and the rules were my speech. The night agreed to that arrangement in its wordless way. The chain tapped, the prince waited. I did the same. I brought the night back to the kiosk because paper still tells the truth when batteries lose their manners. The small service door stuck against snow that had crept under the lip. I shouldered it open, the hinges complaining in a thin, saw-like cry, and slid inside with the shovel to prop the door. The air in there held a calmer cold and smelled of wet staples, wood grain, and the trace of hand sanitizer from last summer's visitors. My headlamp made the place look like a modest shrine, trail map under clouded plastic, lost knit cap on a nail, a jar with pencils half chewed. The lantern on the bench sent its steady blade through the doorway and under the chain, unwilling to be left out. I liked that about it and did not say so out loud. I worked a simple ritual. Gloves off only long enough to rub the radio contacts with a rag from the maintenance bin. Spare batteries rolled in my palm to wake their chemistry. Logbook open to the last clean page. Pencil warmed against my throat until the lead remembered how to write. I logged conditions plain and without poetry. Lot shaped by onshore gusts, closure intact, flares active, auxiliary lamp biased toward the trail mouth, pressure pockets observed, odor intermittent, counter-registering occasional unverified pass. I added a line I had not written before. Contact intermittent, response delayed and damped, likely propagation issues. The pencil felt clumsy and then straightened out, and my hand quit pressing so hard. When I stepped back to the threshold to read the lot through the doorway's frame, the world had arranged itself with that small, deliberate care the storm sometimes shows. The flares crouched inside their own light, like animals warming themselves. The chain tapped with a patience that did not belong to metal. The prints under the furs had softened to bowls at the edges, where blown crystals had finally earned their say, yet the toes still held a clean angle toward the lot, as if wind had learned courtesy. The pocket of quiet lay across the entrance, like a scarf someone had placed carefully while I'd been inside. I counted the steps I would need to cross the porch of snow and stopped, because counting in this voice is a way to make numbers out of feelings, and tonight feelings needed other names. Maps can lie when weather takes the room, so I held the big paper copy up to the plastic and looked past my reflection. Switchbacks marched up their usual slope. Creek shone as a thin thread that vanished under talus. Trails spur to a viewpoint where people go, in fair weather, to take pictures of light on water. Nothing on paper had changed, which left the change in the air, and the air was not my jurisdiction, except to survive it. I used the pencil to tap the board near the trail start. The plastic cover clicked and gave a small echo that sounded too round for a cold sheet. I held the pencil still and tapped again. The echo took a half breath to return, as if the kiosk had grown a deeper interior while my back was turned. I spoke a line into the portable so any later reader would know I had tried. Returning to exterior position, maintaining closure, no entry without support. The set produced a soft courage of static and then steadied into silence. That was answer enough. I shouldered back outside and let the door thud into its latch. Snow had changed texture while I wrote. It now carried that flowery feel that looks light and hides weight. My boots learned the difference at once. I tightened the parka at the throat until the fur cuff made a proper seal and returned to the chain to put a palm on the toe strap draped across the bumper. Nylon holds a kind of chill that speaks even through glove leather. Tonight it felt awake in a small, thrumming way. Not moving, not even drawing tight, just remembering its job in my hand. I laid it back down with a little respect. I took the shovel and shaved the trench I had cut along the inside of the chain so that my body would keep its promise, even if my mind decided to bargain. The blade rasped over the crust and found the wire note again and then lost it, a thread that did not map to wind or load, but to a logic of its own. I chose not to be its student. I scraped the counter's lens until it showed a neat arc of road behind the beam, then let my glove rest on the casing. The device kept its small heart, bright but not hurried. It clicked once while I watched empty air. I told it, because talking to gear is a ranger's habit, that I would not hold that against it. The wrong smell returned in a way that made me want to apologize to the trees. It drifted from the lot toward the firs, then from the firs toward the lot. An indecisive tide that never brought sea. Heated belt in old pond clay, the breath of a culvert in thaw. Though the drainage above us was locked in winter, the lantern leaned its beam to follow the scent, and then steadied on the prints as if reporting. A flake flurry crossed the path of the light and showed its bend clearly for a blink. The air was not uniform. It held seams like water does when it runs mixed in a ditch, warm over cold, scent over clean, pressure over slack. I found one seam with my bare wrist when I reached to reset a flare. Heat rolled down the sleeve and cradled the bones of my hand for one long, unwelcome moment. I said thank you to no one and moved my arm out of it. When I keyed the mic again, the voice I wanted came thin through the blankets and then moved closer as if someone had stepped from a stairwell into a room. Copy on holding. Road remains closed uphill. Second unit attempting departure when chain control releases. The sentence bumped once in the middle like a stone under a sled. I breathed relief without showing it much and offered my neat acknowledgement. They asked if I could reposition to the truck cab for shelter until contact improved. The right answer, the one policy would prefer, hovered on my tongue. I looked at the chain, at the trench I had cut, at the prints that had turned and then held their new regard, at the lantern that had decided to be a compass. The cab with its door seals and its polite dull light belonged to a different kind of night. This one needed a person at the threshold. I said I would remain exterior with intermittent kiosk use for writing and equipment care. The pause after that felt like the radio had put a hand over its own mouth to think. Then the warm voice said understood and asked for regular checks. I promised them, and promises given on the air carry weight even a storm respects. To keep from becoming a statue, I made work. I dug out the plow's turning radius at the lot mouth so the first pass, whenever it came, would have a chance. I reset a flare whose base had drowned in its own melt bowl. I lifted the chain just enough to brush ice from the lower rail and felt the shovel answer in my other hand as the steel transmitted a small, agreeable shiver. When I let the chain fall, the tap resumed, familiar enough now that it kept me company. I ran a hand along the strap again, not to test it, just to remind my body where it lived. When the storm forces you to wait, touch the tools until their locations are stitched into your hands. Then you will not fumble when the hour asks for speed. The prints did their next small thing while I watched the lantern, which is all it ever takes. The nearest heel gained a new, faint cup nested inside the old like a palm within a palm. Not closer, not farther, just a second thought laid into the first, with that tidy care the storm had adopted. The toe still leaned toward the lot. I felt an impulse to speak to them the way you speak to an animal on a porch, voice low, hands visible. Instead, I told the logbook in my head that the marks now showed revision, and that wind had not earned the credit. Saying it that way kept the image from owning me. The forest offered another lesson in patience. Somewhere upslope, a cornice tested its bond with a long, low thrum that did not finish in a collapse. Branches popped and reseeded without drama. The wind took a break and returned dressed in the same clothes. In the slack, the counter declined to click, and its refusal felt like discipline. I placed my palm on its side again, sharing heat with a thing that needs so little and gives me a measured world in return. The casing hummed the soft way a bird does when it goes still on a wire in a squall. I stepped back under the kiosk roof for a breath of stillness that did not belong to the pocket out front. The door eased into its frame with less complaint now that the hinge had warmed from use. Inside, I brushed frost from the logbook and added the new language: nested heel, beam bend, persistent, temperature seam at entrance, odor cycling. I kept the lines clean, no metaphors that a future reader would have to translate after an accident report. I touched the map again and let my eyes run the trail to its first switchback and then the next. The paper held like a good story you have read too many times to mistrust. When I opened the door to step back out, the lot felt narrower by the width of a breath. The flares shared that opinion. Their flames leaned toward each other across the entrance as if greeting old friends. The lantern's blade lay thinner now, a thread pulled tight from the bench to the first mark. The chain made its small music, and, beneath that, a softer sound appeared. Not plow, not creak, but a controlled pull, like webbing sliding over a tailgate. I turned my head and found nothing moving, yet the toe strap on the bumper shifted against itself by the amount a thing moves in a dream. I put 2 fingers on the coil and felt not motion, but a suggestion of direction, the way a river under ice makes your body think of downstream, even when nothing shows. I told dispatch I was maintaining exterior position, that the entrance felt constricted, and that equipment remained functional. The voice thanked me in that steady way that passes for comfort when the road is shut. I set the shovel where it could sing against the rail again, because alarms belong where hands cannot always be. I stood between chain and counter and let the storm write its slow text while I kept my line. The prints held their revision. The pocket of quiet pressed close enough that I could have leaned into it. I did not. I noted its pressure the way you note the presence of a wall in a dark hallway. The night waited with me. The lot was a held breath. I kept it held. The storm eased the way. A tired thing softens its hands. And that softness made the lot feel smaller, not kinder. I stood between chain and counter and heard the night reassemble itself in quiet layers. Roof drip at the kiosk, where ice had learned to breathe. Soft grit of sleet against flares. The low animal sound of trees rubbing somewhere up the gully. The lantern's blade ran thinner now, tightened from bench to trail mouth, like fishing line you can see only when it catches a glint. The prints under the firs kept their nested heel and their tidy tilt toward the gate. I had told the radio I would hold. The radio had answered as best it could. Holding had become its own weather. The toe strap on the bumper had taken to speaking in a voice I didn't know it owned. Nylon says little and cold. Tonight it remembered a tune. Not motion, not a pull, at least not at first. A hum ran along it, faint enough that mitten leather barely carried it to bone. A shiver the way wire sings when wind finds a span between poles. I laid 2 fingers across the coil and felt the sound more than heard it, directionless at the start. Then learning a route, from bumper to chain, from chain to trench, from trench to prints, a circle that did not close so much as keep looking for its last stitch. I told the portable what my hand knew in the neat language a future reader would recognize. Strap resonant, no visual load, tone aligns with prior pressure pockets. The reply was a scuff of static and a comfort without words. I thought about stowing the strap to end the song, then pictured fumbling coils at speed if the night decided to ask for work. Better to give the hum a purpose than to chase it from the room. I ran the loose end through the gate's bar and back to the truck, a quick hitch that would let me block the entrance without driving steel into snow or driving the truck into anything at all. The move broke no rule. It made the closure truer. When the hook settled, the hum found a cleaner path and gathered a thin strength, like a string tuned toward a note that lives between known pitches. The blade of the lantern leaned as if to listen. The nearest flare made a small bow. Pressure seams run like secret corridors across winter ground. You learn to find them with your wrist and your breath. I walked the strap's line without stepping over the trench I had cut, palm held low to feel where air met air. Warmth rolled off the entrance at knee height and pooled in a shallow basin on the lot side of the chain, a basin the storm had not dug. When I bent with my glove near the snow, the belt and pond odor met me at the same level, not rising, not eager, simply present like a room where the heat has been left on. I eased upright so blood would not rush to a head that had work to do. The counter ticked then, not hurried, not shy, a single sober count in a world that would not be caught standing on a scale. The beam path was empty. The lens was clean. I pressed my palm against the casing to claim its small heart and felt another pulse through it, not from within, but from the strap's note coming up through the post and into the housing, a music box someone had wound with gloves. I told it to keep to its work and stepped back so my body would not become part of a circuit I could not diagram. When the wind returned, it did so like a test. A push from the gully slid along the chain and found the strap. The hum deepened, slow as a yawn in heavy cloth, and the truck's frame answered with the faintest of creaks. I checked the brake with my boot, then kicked a wedge of packed snow behind a tire to make a chock of necessity. The strap lifted a hair and settled. The prints took their own small liberty, not forward, not back, but with a new stir inside the nested heel, a rounding that suggested weight shift and settled again. I told the night, which is to say I told myself, that snow remembers what has stood upon it, and that memory can change its posture without adding new facts. Saying it kept my hand steady while I tightened the hitch. The lantern's blade narrowed once more and pulsed in a way that wanted to match my breath. I refused and made mine slower than that. The flare nearest the trench guttered low, not with wind, not in panic, but as if the air had lengthened between flame and fuel. I knelt, lifted the little body, and reset it an arm's length farther from the trench, my palm passing through a layer of heat that did not belong to any honest fire. A whisper of melted wax brushed my glove, and then froze hard, a shell around a shell. I let the flare work and stepped back into cold that made sense. The strap's song climbed half a step, then held. In that tone I heard the road, or anyway I wanted to. A light rose down canyon like hope and made the storm show its threads. I lifted an arm and kept it high. The light lifted, paused, dimmed into drift, then lifted again, farther than it should have in that time. I did not lower my arm until my shoulder bit my patience. When I did, the lot returned to its smaller room, and the strap kept to its new note. I looked at the trench and the chain as if two lines could keep a world sorted. Sometimes they can. Policy likes people in warm cabs when contact weakens. The cab had its own argument with me. Dome lamp that learned new tricks, wiring that remembered other nights, seals that whispered of easy rest. I chose the colder post because the night had paid me the courtesy of showing where it meant to press, and those seams met at the gate, not at the door of a truck. I told dispatch as much in plain language, left the carrier open long enough for a human voice to arrive, heard the click of thought and the acceptance that follows it. After the call, the hallway returned. The strap answered the silence with the steady kindness of a thing that has found the job it was made for. The shovel's blade on the lower rail gave me a second alarm. Steel to steel, bone to bone. I repositioned it so that the least lift would translate into my hands without any need to look. Under the blade, the rail had grown a frost line that resembled rime on river stones. I brushed it and felt the rail give back a tiny vibration that matched the strap's tone a breath later. Not same, but kin. I set the blade down and refused to be a tuning fork. I took another turn inside the kiosk, not to hide, but to write. The logbook received the new plain words. Strap rigged as barrier, resonant tone stable, no visual load, flare bowed at entrance, temperature seemed persistent, counter intermittent. I kept my hand from adding color by keeping the pencil moving. The map under its cloudy cover kept the trail in the place we had agreed long before my first storm. That steadied me more than I like to admit. Outside again, I saw the lot had changed by a degree you feel before you find the sentence for it. The pocket of quiet crossed the trench and settled against the chain as if it had received permission. The chain did not lift. The strap did not slacken. The prints kept their tilt toward the lot, their nested cup deepened by a breath. The lantern's line trembled and then steadied along the strap's run, a blade of light following a rope. The hum rose until it balanced just this side of shrill and stayed there, a wire that had found its span. I moved to the truck and eased the seat forward until my boot could find the brake without guesswork if I needed to hold the frame. I did not start the engine. I did not want other voices in the room. I checked the rear for anything that might become shrapnel if the strap had to earn its pay. Only snow and the honest, dull weight of a spare wheel. I closed the door without letting the dome lamp think it had a vote. Back at the gate, I placed my palm on the strap where it crossed steel. The vibration ran through leather into skin and anchored there, not up the arm, not into chest, but sitting patient in the heel of the hand, like a small animal that has decided to trust you because you are what the hour offers. If a line has to sing, you want it to sing where you can hear it. I adjusted the hitch until the tone and the chain's tap made a separate music. Not cacophony, not lockstep, two truths that could live in the same air without swallowing each other. Then I stood between them and let them teach my pulse which rhythm to choose. The storm laid its veil in slow drafts. The trees held their breath the way a crowd does when a tight line is about to load. My job narrowed until it fit in a mitten. Hold the line, note the changes, do not be drawn into a stage not meant for you. When the next change came, it asked for a decision I could give without breaking the rule. The strap drew tight a fraction, the hum knocked higher, and the coil brushed the bumper with a dry kiss. The chain stayed honest, but it wanted to climb a hair. I set my shoulder to the bar and gave it the weight a person can offer when a tire chock is only compacted snow. The vibration gentled under my palm and spread through steel, then ran out along the strap into the air above the trench. The nearest flare lifted its flame back to proud. The lantern's blade brightened a touch and laid itself along the line like a level. I told the portable what the body already knew. Line loaded but holding, closure reinforced, no breach. The radio did not answer, which in this case was a kindness. The prints under the furs did not advance. They did not retreat. Their bowls shone a little, as if polished by breath. The pocket of quiet kept its place against the chain. The strap sang in a key I could stand. I kept standing. The lot was a narrow room built of tools and promises. I stayed in the room until the room agreed to keep me, and the night agreed to keep its name to itself. Toe straps and chains do not ask for belief. They demand weight, and give back answers in steel and fiber. I stood with a palm on the line and felt its voice gather until the hum settled into a pitch that matched the tightness in my jaw. The lantern's blade thinned to a thread and lay along the strap as if it had found a riverbed. The flares crouched low and did their small, quiet work, their flames bowing and straightening in slow ceremony. The prints under the furs held their nested heel and their tidy lean toward the lot, each bowl shining a little as if it had learned to reflect a sky the storm was hiding. The pocket of quiet folded against the chain and stayed there like a polite guest who has taken the last chair and won't be dislodged by small talk. The wind rested. The trees listened. There is a time in any long night when you stop expecting the simple path and make a room out of what you have. Mine was a rectangle bounded by truck, chain, trench, kiosk. I put my back to the bar and set a boot where my body knew the brake would be if I needed to reach it without turning. I gave the strap a small, honest inch to take up with, then pulled the slack from the hitch with gloved fingers that had forgotten luxury. The hum flattened and steadied. The chain tapped twice and then fell quiet in a way that made me want it back. I set the shovel's blade against the lower rail so any lift would speak, and I found the counter's housing with my other hand, and took its small heart, like a reminder that certain instruments keep to their promises even when the air learns too many tricks. I tried the portable and heard breath and hallway and the warm voice somewhere beyond both, ready but bridled by distance. I gave the tidy words anyway, line loaded, closure reinforced, holding exterior, no entry, and let go of the button to hear whether the night would offer me the click of a human thinking. It gave me only the strap climbing a shade tighter as the wind returned with that slow, testing hand a storm uses when it wants to see whether the pieces you've placed will hold. The truck's frame answered with a hushed creak. Snow at my boots settled, as if remembering a shape it had worn once and liked. I felt the draw move through steel into my shoulder and down my spine, a long, patient request that was not a pull, so much as a suggestion that never tired. There are two mistakes on nights like this. One is to fight what you cannot lift. The other is to make a stage out of a thing that is content to be a corridor. I chose a third path, the one we teach without writing. Feed a line until it lands where it means to land, then make that land be where you can live. I eased the hitch a breath and gave the strap a softer angle through the gate, away from the trench's lip, so the line's wheel would find the plowed lot instead of the first step of the trail. The hum dropped into a kinder register. The lantern's thread brightened. The flare by the trench straightened its flame and held it like a spine. The chain did not climb. I felt a small thank you rise and let it fall inside my mask where only my breath could hear it. The wrong smell came and went. Belt heat braided with pond clay. Never strong, never ownership. Always the polite insistence of a traveler who asks for a wall to lean on, but not a bed. It moved with the pocket of quiet the way fog moves with hollows, never rushing, never claiming the high ground. I lifted my wrist through the seam and felt warmth pool around bones that had forgotten that word. The seam slid along the strap and over the trench, pushed by nothing I could see, and settled again against the chain as if checking the height of a sill. When the seam touched the shovel blade, a gentle vibration ran into the handle and up into the mitten, the smallest of invitations. I refused to be led by small things. The prints took their turn, not forward, not back, not multiplied. The nearest toe deepened a fraction. A second thought pressed into snow that had already remembered more than I wanted it to. The bowls gleamed and dulled in a rhythm that had nothing to do with wind and everything to do with timing I could not chart. The counter did not click. That refusal was mercy. I told the portable I was holding steady and got a wordless breath in reply that felt like someone nodding in another room. A long patience settled over the lot. The trees rubbed once and then learned stillness. The plow blade that did not exist made its glossy hush from uphill and forgot to echo. The lantern's blade hummed like level glass. The strap's tone held in the space that lives between notes. My shoulder burned where steel asked for a body, and I gave it one. Cold moves in, then it moves through, then it moves out and leaves salt. I felt that tide, and used it to count the slow beats every ranger learns to count when a watch face has gone from useful to mean. I thought about stepping into the truck to bring nerve back to fingers, then pictured the dome lamp waking with its old trick, and decided my nerves would have to be warmed by work. Work presented itself. The flare by the lot mouth had melted a small bowl and begun to list. I moved to reset it and felt the strap's song ride the air at my knee, like a string across an opening. When I crossed back, the chain lifted the small distance a person calls a hair when they do not want to give the night a number. The shovel blade whispered against the rail. I set my shoulder and gave back weight with a steadiness I had learned on deadfall days when a winch line will wander if your breath does. The line accepted that language and settled, not slack, never slack, only accepting that it could sing without climbing. The storm began to erode itself. Flakes fell heavier and fewer, like a hand releasing slowly. The world gathered edges. The kiosk roof stopped its drip and started to breathe. The firs wore collars of pale light that did not belong to a lamp. I knew what that meant, and did not hurry it. I waited with the line and the chain and the counter and the shovel until the sky climbed a shade lighter and made the lot a room with walls again. Dawn in this country is not triumph. It is a careful agreement between ice and day. The strap's tone softened until it was only a memory in my hand. The pocket of quiet let go of the chain without drama and moved back toward the trail mouth, as if a chair had been pushed in. The wrong smell thinned to an idea, and then to nothing I could claim with a nose. With day, the prints were allowed to be readable. They stood where they had stood, except they did not. The nested heel closest to the trench had divided in a way only daylight can show. A pale new cup inside the old that edged not toward the lot, and not toward the trail, but along the chain, as if a choice had presented itself and had been entertained without being taken. Beyond the chain, on the lot side, a single soft bowl showed beneath drift, the way a track does when wind forgets to finish a job. I crouched and brushed with the back of a mitten until the shape gathered. Heel, toe, tilt. I looked between chain posts for an interruption, for a place where steel had lifted or snow had turned to water and back. The bar was where I had kept it, the padlock where I had left it, the trench a shallow script my shovel could read aloud. No crossing mark, no broken crust, just a footprint on the wrong side of a boundary and a patient set of its kin on the right. The portable found its voice the way a person finds a hallway door. Clear line, warm tone, second unit rolling from the sheds at last. I gave my report in plain language and left nothing out that a ranger with my badge would want to read later. They asked if I required medical. I looked at my hands and found a patch of pale sting at the base of the palm, where steel had pressed through leather, a cold bruise that would turn education-colored by evening. I said negative and meant it, then added a request for a new counter lens cover, because the one before me had developed a hairline I could feel with a nail. They promised what they could promise and asked me to remain until relief arrived. Remaining was all I had, so I gave them the easiest yes of the night. I unhooked the strap with slow hands and felt the line's last vibration let go, not snapped, not defeated, simply done with its song. The hook left a clean lick of frost on the bar where it had rested. I coiled the webbing and found grit frozen inside the weave, as if it had been dragged through a shallow stream. I shook it out and watched nothing fall. The chain took back its small tap, which I allowed because honest noises are the only truths I wanted. The lantern's beam lost its green cast and became what it had been at season start, a modest circle content to light notices and knit caps. I clicked it off and let the world write in day ink. The other truck's light climbed the canyon with a steadiness I recognized and learned to trust many winters ago. When it pulled into the mouth, it moved with the care of a person stepping into a room where someone else has been waiting. The ranger who stepped down smelled of diesel and wool, and the kind of coffee that can keep you company without helping. We did not say much. I showed the trench, the strap mark, the counter, the prints. I did not point at the bowl on the lot side. I brushed it with a mitten so he would find it himself. He did, and breathed the word that means acknowledgement without narrative. We stood there as the storm unstitched itself from the trees and slid uphill to trouble another shift. My cost came into clarity as we handled the ordinary tasks that follow an odd night. The truck's bumper wore a bend no report would explain to a person who prefers diagrams. The base of my palm throbbed where the strap had taught bone to listen, a lesson that would keep me from using a tool for a few days whether I liked it or not. The edge of the shovel, sharp and true when the evening began, had learned a ripple I had not put there. The counter's lens carried its hairline. None of it was ruin. All of it was exact. I logged each piece with the tidy words that make a file coherent and leave room for a mind to breathe. When the relief ranger told me to get warm, I walked to the cab and let the door open without waking the dome lamp. I sat with the engine off and the parka open and watched the chain hold a simple line in daylight. Furs shook loose the last lace of the night. The prints under them did not leave and did not deepen. The bowl on the lot side took the sun and let the shine go dim when the light moved on. I could have stayed to see whether it would soften into ordinary by noon. That was not my job. My job had been to hold the line through a night that wanted names and did not get them. I turned the key only when my fingers remembered how to do it without shaking. The heater made equipment air, nothing more. I took that gift. When I looked back through the glass, the strap lay coiled, the chain shone with a plain frost, and the entrance was only an entrance again, except for the way the day kept glancing there as if someone had told it a story.